and how to use the equipment. Just a conflict of interest declaration, which we normally do at the playground meetings and the standard meetings. There we go. I'm a NADA test laboratory, inspector of playgrounds, a playground impact tester, an importer of equipment. I import the wireless value equipment into Australia, and there's about 20 of them around Australia. And got to get the next slide up. There we go. Okay, these are a few of the slides that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about what HIC and critical fault height is. Critical fault height is the height in metres where the impact reaches the HIC of 1,000 or the other criteria. I'm going to talk about what the standard says on impact attenuation, all three of them, because it's mentioned in all three standards that we use, and how it compares with the impact attenuation surface and what injuries you get out of that. A little bit of Acoustascan. Started in '93, got 4 people in Australia. We've got a bit of a worldwide operation happening here because of COVID. A lot of the jobs I used to do overseas, I've had to now get other employees around the world to be able to do it for me. And I've got a guy in France, in India, in Thailand, and at the moment, the ones in Thailand are in full lockdown, a bit like Australia. And so they've had to now travel the world, and they're basically based in France and then flying back into Africa. So there's lots of little green squares appearing in Africa where Acoustascan is tested. What they have to do then is send samples back to me, and I do the testing in the lab in Australia, and then upload that information into the FIFA portal for the soccer and the world rugby and the hockey testing around the world. Some highlights of testing that I've done over the years. I've tested the Melbourne Cricket Ground, Sydney Cricket Ground, done trampoline testing, bouldering testing, gold projects in Africa, and national stadiums all over the world. So, critical fault height. Let's jump into it. This is showing what the critical fault height means to a playground. So the critical fault height is related to the surface. This relates to the falling height of the equipment and has to be greater than the equipment. So the critical fault height of the surface is greater than the fall from the equipment. That means we need to know how soft the surface is. We know concrete is hard. We know rubber, bark and grass and playgrounds are soft, but how soft are they? This is typical surfaces you get. You get sand and rubber and other rubber type surfaces. You can get a full, these ones here are rubber rollout pads for running tracks and thin surfaces, and you get thick rubber in different areas. So I might be putting a lot of words up on the screen, but I'll just talk about it generally. This is a lot of the comments straight out of the standard, and you can read that as I talk along. So the critical fault height is when the HIC is less than 1,000 and the Gmax is less than 200, or T1 or T2 is greater than 3 milliseconds at a drop height in meters. So that we're rating the surface and we're working out what this surface critical fault height is going to be. This is more the definition in the standards. And if you read all three standards, these definitions can be slightly different, which is a bit off-putting. But the critical fault height of the surface in meters. Other standards can have different requirements. We all talk about 1,000 HIC and 200 G, but there's actually other codes out there that use different requirements. For instance, bouldering uses 200 HIC and 50 G as an impact requirement. So everybody's thinking of the injury problems with hitting 1,000 HIC, whereas in other sports they actually lower it for different reasons. Bouldering mats, for instance, have 600 HIC. Each one is specific to each sport. Some sports specify the critical fault height in metres. For instance, World Rugby, they say we need a critical fault height of 1.3 metres using the HIC requirement of 1,000. So the critical fault height versus free height of fall. Any fall is dangerous from any height, which is why we need the impact attenuation fall surface. The critical fault height has to be greater than the free height of fall. You might be getting sick of me saying that, but I'm trying to drum this into everybody on these requirements. The thing is, though, we also need to know where it came from and how it relates to us from from previous days. And if you read the forward of the standard in 4422, it lets you know the chance of any injury, for the possibility of an injury when impacted at 1000 HIC. I do a talk when explaining the drop testing equipment, whereas if you fall in the street, you get king hit, you trip over and you hit your head on the concrete, you sustain an impact to the head which is greater than 200 G. It's a fast impact, less than 3 milliseconds, and it can crack your skull. This is equivalent to a ball peen hammer hitting the head and your skull breaks. And you have a concussion, which is very severe, which happens every day when you look at the news. You'll end up in hospital, and on the news you'll see every night someone's fallen over or hit their head on the concrete or a gutter, or even had a fight, and they've ended up in hospital because they've hit their head. So we know that concrete is hard, it's a hard impact, and we know impact attenuating surface is a soft impact, but how soft is it? And that's what the critical fall height determines. There is a lot of talk and research at the moment with head impact assessments in all sports and traumatic brain injuries. It's an injury that affects how the brain works. TBI is a major cause of death and disability. This is what we are trying to avoid. There's a whole complex topic, what I won't talk about today. What we need to know is what height we can climb above these soft surfaces before you have an injury. This means if you fall from a playground, will the surface catch me? Is it soft enough? One of the things I see all the time is people walk into a surface, a playground area, and they jam their foot up and down and they go, yeah, this is nice and soft. It'll be okay. It'll pass. Now, I've been doing it since '93 and I can't tell. You can have a soft surface that is only 20 mil thick with concrete underneath it, and it feels okay with your foot when you walk into it. But it could only have a critical fall height of 500 millimeters because the head will punch through the 20 mils and hit the concrete below, and you'll end up with a sharp impact, a very narrow time impact. And you can have a hard surface that feels like concrete under your foot, but it's 100 millimeters thick and gives you a 3 meter critical fall height. And I've walked on a few of these and going, oh, this can't be a soft fall surface. It's so friggin' hard. I can't even jump up and down. It doesn't move at all. But as soon as you drop the head tells you a different story. And that is also why we do a thickness measurement now to determine the thickness of what's in the rubber. So in the standard, we should be doing the inspection and doing impact test and also doing the thickness of the surface to know how thick it is. So we can correlate the thickness to the actual critical fall height of the surface. Now, this isn't the whole story because you have to take into account the density of the product, how it moves, the temperature, humidity of the day. That is why we need to do impact test, just to make sure the product is performing how it is designed. Now, the abbreviated injury score on the SI unit as well is compared to the HIC impact. Now, this comes from the severity curve, which is up on the screen there. And this also shows as a guide to the injury data is different for different ages and different sexes and different nationalities. So some studies try to link the acceleration of the head to the probability that this can be fatal to humans or do not cause injury. This is why you come back to the statement in the standard about the probability of injuries. And it is the amount of research which still needs to be done to improve this is happening all the time. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a few things to do with the standards. And 4685.1 has Annex H, which is nominative, which is you either have informative or nominative. So nominative means that you really should, it's part of the standard, it's included in the standard. And it's like a list of to-do list for impact attenuation. It tells you what you need to do. I haven't put the whole annex in here, but it is good to read and it tells you what you need to do. When you buy the standard, you also have to go to the back of the standard and you look at the ZZ appendixes, the areas that need changing. Now, one of these in the standard is table 4. And then this table talks about impact attenuation for natural material, mainly bark, grass, sand. And it was taken out of the standard. It is nothing like what we have in Australia. The soil and the earth in Australia we have is very hard. It has a high content. And with the seasons in Australia, the ground gets very hard as it dries out over winter and summer. So a lot of the time people try to say, I don't need an impact surface. I've got beautiful grass here. I've got no problems at all. Can you can I use that? And I've been on several sites where people have tried with child services to say, I'm not putting the softwall surface down, we're just going to do grass. And the docs people went, well, yes, you can do that, but you've got to get it tested every 6 months. So the first 6 months I came back, it passed fine, and they were only looking at a 1.2 fall height on this really old bit of timber gear, which was also a death trap. And the next 6 months I came back and they'd had a drought and all the grass had gone and we were basically on dirt and we had a fall height of 500 mils. And so they made the point that they needed to put a surface down because you couldn't keep the grass going, you couldn't keep it up. And if you look at any sporting event in any city in Australia, by the end of winter's nice and wet at the beginning, you can dry out at the end, and then the ground goes really hard and you might start with lovely grass, but at the end of it, it's just a dust bowl and dirt bowl because it gets overused. So 468.0 is a great standard. It has the basic definition in there of that the critical fall height has to be greater than the free height of fall, which is wonderful. But the one I like about this standard is that it has the sharps and the bark colour photographs at the back of it. So we're able to add them into the test as sharps as a squeeze test. So that's actually my wife's hand there, showing the timber all sticking into it. So bark is needed to be tested or is sold, and I'm a 17025 test lab and can test these products to the standard. What I ask for, I get them to send me a sample in a small clip-lock bag for free. So just send it to me and I'll have a look at it and I'll tell you it's any good. I get it, and as soon as I get the small sample, it's always wet and damp, and the guy at the other end who has done this little squeeze test in your hand and think it's wonderful, and I do it, it's fine, but then I put it in the oven and I dry it out. And next day I come back and I do the sharp test again, and 50% of the products I get sent fail. A lot of the time people are trying to sell garden mulch into the industry where it's just chopped up anything and then send it off and get it done. And so then I talk to them and I tell them how to actually get the product to be a state. And they need to put it through a hammer mill, and they need to round it and roll it or put it in a rumbling mill, where they put it in a big mixer and put steel shot in there that actually rumbles it and softens it up and grinds it. And then out of that, you only get about 50% of the product that's any good to actually go into a playground. So they have to do a bit of work to actually get this material to actually comply. The soft bark mulches are usually better, but they end up with a bit of whitewood in it, and they end up with splinters in it as well. The problem we have with this is that I will get sent a sample, I will test it, I'll give them a certificate, I'll work out its critical fall height, and I'll test it dry, and I'll test it wet. And the bark products are great. I usually get over 3 meters, 3 and 4 meters. I can't tell them that. I have to say that it has greater than 3 meters because the standard is written so that it has a maximum height of 3 meters. So there is some fine print here to say that I tested it and they actually get 5 meters out of it, but I can't say that. I have to say it's only 3 meters that they get. But as long as it's a maximum of 3 meters, they can use it anywhere in the playground, then that's fine. So 4422 also has a great little statement in it about the kids, and which is basically the statement of why we do this and look after the playgrounds is because of the children's development and children's perception of successful negotiation of risk. It's important to be confident in building and competent in risk assessment for the kids so that they learn up and they know how to do this. And the impact attenuation service is a main part of that. They realise that, you know, we don't go play on concrete, but we can play on a soft surface, and we know we're not going to have a life-threatening injury, hopefully, if we don't fall when we fall from the playground. So how do we determine the critical fall height? There's 2 options. We can do it by the lab method, which is 4 drops in one spot. Now, it mentions in the standard that that is a lab testing, but it is also used on-site testing. Because sometimes the option 2 measured fall height with the 1 drop method might fail, and then you might have to do the 4 drops to determine the critical fall height of the surface. The 1 drop method is just purely a pass-fail requirement. If it's dropped 10% above and it passes the free height of fall, when there's 1 drop, you can walk away. So what I'm going to do is show a quick video of Andrew doing some testing, and I'll just talk through this while I do it. and explain to what he was doing. Now, we got up very early during the week and wanted to go to this playground particularly. So what he's done there is he's done the thickness measurement of the material. So we know it's approximately 100 millimeters thick. So it's quite a thick rubber surface. It'll give you like a 2.5 to 3 meter critical fault height of the surface. So we got up early in the morning and we were trying to beat the people because this is a very, very popular playground. And we were hurrying to do it. And as Andrew, if you watch that, the temperature's dropping. He just took it out of his pocket and it actually goes down to 8 degrees. So it was quite a cold morning. So we were hurrying to do it. So when he does this drop here, he doesn't have time to steady the head properly. So he's picking it up. And the way the Bluetooth impact tester works is it's controlled by a phone. And you can put it on any phone and you press a button and it drops it. It works out the height that it's dropped from, and it also works out the HIC and impact, which I'll show you those results later. And I'll just click through a few of those drops for Andrew. He'll do about 4 drops at different heights, and the phone automatically plots the height that you're dropping it from. So after 2 drops, it will give an estimation of what the critical fault height is of the surface. Because one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to drop it at 1000 HIC. You want to drop 2 above that 1000 HIC, and you want to drop 2 below. And so you let the software plot the graph and actually work out exactly where 1000 HIC is. Now, I'm talking about 1000 HIC because it's a soft surface. If it was a thinner surface, it might actually fail. I'll show you those results later. Might actually fail on the G. So if it punched through and hit the G max, or the G came up higher than the HIC, well, then the critical fault height will be based on that G max result, not the HIC result. And 2122 was sitting in the background there monitoring it, that the impact is not less than 3 milliseconds either in the speed. So I'd have to point out today that Andrew's sporting the COVID look of a 0 shaved head today, because we're all in lockdown. And as you come up here with the rather large playground, big fort that they've built in the middle of Oakley Park, and it'll spin around, you'll see that because it's COVID, there is no boats in the water. There is no one around because of COVID. We're all in lockdown. So when you go out into particularly Oakley Park, it does get very busy of people walking and running and exercising in Oakley Park. That's why we had to get up so early in the morning to do this job for the exercise. Now my next trick is how to get to the next slide. There we go. Oh. Right. Okay, so this is what Andrew would have seen on the phone, or can see on the phone. I actually have a pointer, don't I? Pen, laser pointer. Pen. Okay. So you can see my pointer, okay? Yeah.
Can you hover it over?
Oh, hang on.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, different screen. So we have a HIC of 834. We have a maximum G of 150. It gives you the acceleration of what it hit the surface at, a drop height of 1, an impact speed in meters per second, a fall time, how long it took from the time it was released to the time it hit, and the important HIC time. So out of this, you get 3 bits of information. You're getting the HIC, the Gmax, and the time, the T122. And as long as that's greater than 3 milliseconds, the colour on the screen in this second one here will be correct. If it goes less than 3 milliseconds, this will change blue. This one here, this HIC result here is red because it's over 1000 HIC. So you know that it's reached the limit of 1000 HIC. But we want 2 drops above the 1000 HIC. Up the top here, we got a critical drop height, HIC 1.3 meters, but we also have it in Gmax. So if we plot this graph by the G acceleration and G, it'll give you a higher result. That's because it's a soft surface. So it's actually reaching the limit of 1000 HIC at 1.3 meters. And if you come down to this one, you have a drop height of 1.39. Come to the one at the bottom, which is even higher at 1.58. you get 1428. So we want these two HOCs to be above 1,000, and we want these two HOCs to be below 1,000, and that gives us a good graph. And this over here is a typical impact that you get. So if you imagine the head hitting the surface here, and then it goes into the surface, say through 20 mil of the wear layer on top, then it starts to hit the shock pad or the rubber crumb underneath, and then this is maybe they put down 2 layers. There's another little bump there. Then it goes into the surface, reverses acceleration and back out, and comes back down to 0. This happens over a set amount of time. So that's 0.55 of a second to 0.57 of a second, which can relate to our time of probably, 4.5 milliseconds, or if I've subtracted that's like 20 milliseconds. But on the side here, we're measuring G. So the machine actually measures everything in G, or gravities. So this is 100 gravities at the top here. It's when you convert it and double integrate this to work out the area under the curve that works out the HOC inside this thing here, based on T1, T2, which would be about there. But I should show that in a second.
Hey, Grant.
Yep.
Quick question from Bob. Are all impact testing machines set to 3 milliseconds?
That's a good question. There's a software setting in the machine most machines have it set in there that you can actually adjust that. There was the standard back in 1177, back in 2006, had a very weird clause in there saying that everything had to be greater than 3 milliseconds. So some of the companies actually had their software cut off at 3 milliseconds. So you knew nothing happened below that. You didn't have any data below 3 milliseconds, which was ridiculous because you didn't get any high impacts. It didn't show you the high. So guess what? Everything passed. So there was a big problem with that. So yeah, that got rectified in about 2006. That was a big problem with the machine. Some of the machines overseas the software was written a little bit wrong. So what you got on the screen now is the graphs. And if you look on the left screen, you have HOC. Along the bottom, you have height. And along the right, you have Gmax. And so we've plotted 200G. It comes out at a height at 1.48. We've plotted 1,000 HOC, and it comes out at 1.3. And so we've got our two drops below and 2 drops above on these little arrows, and that plots the curves. That's why you don't want to try and impact at 1,000 HOC, because you want to get this to be plotted nicely. Now, there's also modifications to the standards that are coming out, which will actually specify, if you look at the EN standard at the moment overseas, they say you have to have like 150 HOC between each drop, or 150 millimeters in height between each drop, just so we get a better spread. We don't want to have 4 drops at the one height and the software goes haywire. It'll go negative and things like that. Anyway, that's in the future. And this is another controversial area where we're talking about the measured fall height. Now, this is the definition for doing the second option of where you can do 1 drop and the surface passes and you're completed, you're finished. But it's only a pass-fail requirement. It doesn't work out the critical fall height of the surface. So this is the definition. So the measured fall height allows 1 drop to be done 10% higher than the free height of fall. And if it passes at that HM, this speeds up the testing to 90% of the surface we normally test and they pass easily. So 90% of the surfaces out there are great with 1 drop. It's only when that you get close to that critical fall height and it starts failing that 10% requirement, then you have to go back and do the critical fall height and do 4 drops and actually work out the critical fall height of the surface. And a lot of the time, about 99% of the time when it might fail on the 1 drop method, it will pass on the 4 drop method. It might end up being the same height as the free height of fall, or the critical fall height, or just a fraction over, like 50 mil over. But a lot of the time it does pass. And the reason we did this too, to come up with the measured fall height, was to encourage the installers to realise that the rubber out there deteriorates with time. So if you're adding an extra 10% to the critical fall height of that surface, you've at least hopefully covered yourself for litigation in case someone hurts themselves, that over 10 years that product's out there, that the rubber will harden up, it'll decay, it'll get dirty, it'll get filled with mud, and the critical fall height could then get lower. So yeah, it's not a good idea to install it at the free height of fall of any equipment. You better to be a bit over. And so the 10% idea was also to encourage that. There's been a few testers who are confused about this point, and to help improve the definition in the standard, I have amended the standard and submitted the standards, as I'm trying to get an amendment through to 4422 to remove any ambiguity in the standard. So we just put a couple of sentences in there just to try and clear this up a bit better. It was a bit hard to understand that if the HM fails, the HC must be calculated, which is up there in red on the screen, and the HC being the critical fall height. So people didn't realise it. One thing that we did too, I think Andrew did, was introduce all the abbreviations into the standard. So we've got HM and HC and HF. It makes it a little bit easier to understand. It's hard though to change old habits because, you know, CHF has always been critical fall height to me and free height of fall.
Hey Grant, another question from the chat from Monique. How many test locations do you do in a play space area? For example, do you do 1 metre square grid or one impact zone under a piece of play equipment? How do you choose the number of locations?
Good question. It's actually written in the standard. At the back of the standard, there's a list in part 0, I think. Oh. There's a location requirement of where you do the impact tests, and so if you have a childcare area, you're doing one test every 10 square metres. If you're doing a swing, you're doing it a couple in the swing area, but it's all laid out in diagrams in that standard. For instance, an overhead event or a spinner will be different, and so they'll have different requirements on. So it depends on the equipment you're actually looking at, how many you're doing. But basically, you're looking at to do it in the fall zone. Say if you've got a unit, which we've got on the screen here, you'll be looking at doing it around the equipment, where the kid's going to fall off the equipment. And you basically look at that and say, well, the kid is going to work here. The other thing you've got to watch out for though is wear and tear, particularly in childcare centres. They'll have fixed equipment, and I can walk into a childcare centre and I'll test at the very back of the childcare centre, and I'll get a 1.5 metre critical fall height out of it because and this might even be a 5-year-old unit and it's never been run on or played on, and so that gives me a baseline to test right at the back, because then I know that that's what the surface was originally. Then I go and test it at the front where they all run into the area, and it could change down to 1 metre. The thing is though, that isn't where the kids are falling. So then you go to the equipment, and hopefully the equipment's not right at the back door, and you'll find that the fall height would have changed from say 1.5 down to 1.2 after 5 years. On a, say, artificial grass system with a foam system underneath, they tend to compact a bit more than the rubber systems do. The rubber systems will be more like 100 mils over 5 years, and then maybe another 100 mils after the next 5 years on the height. So it's a good question though.
Grant, could I ask a question that might be there might be a simple answer? Would it help if suppliers of these individual play equipment items included information for the purchaser as to what is the testing area that needs to be tested, so that the suppliers know that?
That's a good question. There should be special situations where a supplier has built a special bit of equipment where they should define where it needs to be tested, because it would solve a lot of arguments about testing. Space nets is one that comes to mind. It can be quite challenging to actually test a space net, to actually get it to the right positions and get the head in the right position to actually get the impact surface tested. And there are new designs out there. But 90% of the stuff we do comes under a category. If it doesn't come under a category, well then, yes, it would be a good idea. And that's also like the product certification you get from the manufacturers, where they tell you what the free height of fall is and what the critical fall height of the surface is. And our standards are very good at defining that, and there's a whole lot of things in there that they have to do. And that brings me into product testing, which is what I've got on the screen at the moment. And rubber is a unitary surfacing, and 4 drops in one spot to get a critical fall height to actually work out the critical fall, and tested at 3 per square metre. So this is in the lab testing when I'm testing a product for that certification. And I have a list of all these on my website. Because I'm the only one doing the testing to NATA to 17025, I have a list on my website which is getting updated at the moment. It's about a year out of date, and put everybody up there. So if you want to know who's had their services tested, you can go to the website and look it up and actually see which manufacturers. Now, a lot of them are wet pore rubber people, artificial grass people, and bark mulch suppliers and wood chip suppliers. Artificial grass is classed as loose fill, bark is classed as loose fill, so this testing is slightly different to the wet pore rubber. Sand is classed as a loose material as well, and sand has an issue with water. It's very hard when wet. Bark has an issue with sharps, and artificial grass has an issue of losing the infill on high-rise buildings. So sand is very tricky in impact attenuating surfaces. It's small, it's great for making bricks. When the sand is wet, the critical fall height of the sand is like 300 millimetres. Now, this is a normal playground sand or sandpit sand you'll get anywhere in Victoria and New South Wales. Queensland, though, up north, Cairns and Townsville has really nice big round sand, so they tend to have a lot better sand. So it's very difficult to get good critical fall height sand. When it's dry, the critical fall height of sand can be greater than 1.5 metres. But when it's wet, it can take a month to dry out with no rain. If it does, it's usually only the top of the surface that actually dries out, and it's still wet underneath. To get the sand to be a good critical fall height sand, it has to be bigger than 0.8 of a millimetre round and similar size. If the sand is too small and large and a mixture of sand, it can compact and doesn't move and binds up, and that's another bad thing. So in the standard, we actually have a ratio, a uniformity coefficient ratio, which is actually to do with the sieve analysis of the sand. So I have to sieve the sand, work out the sieve analysis of the sand, look at the morphology of the sand, the shape of it, and you can see the different samples there. And you can see this, I got my pointer? Yeah, this is quite large, rocky sand, but actually it was very bad because it was very angular. This was smaller round sand, which performed really well. And these two, this one performed a lot better because it was more round, and this one here was, this one produced like 2 metres and this one about 1.5 metres. So you've got to be really careful with sands. And the other problem with sands is that I'm testing it every 3 years. So what happens in the meantime? They're not digging up the same lot of sand that they sent me, and same with the bark and the mulch when they send the wood chip. And so what's been happening is people will ring me up and say, oh, can I have a certificate for the next 3 years for this? I said, well, you've got to send me a sample first. So, oh, we're using the same stuff. We haven't changed it. I said, well, send me the sample. So I get the sample. The first sample I tested was bark. The next one I got was wood chip. So, yeah, they kind of changed the sample. So they lose control of their quality control in getting these products to market. That's my little rant about that. Calibration and proficiency testing. One of the things that I have to do to prove that I can calibrate this equipment, I'm actually certified to calibrate equipment and the accelerometers, and I have to do it to do 2 different standards, and it has to be my scope of accreditation under 17025. So I have a reference accelerometer that is calibrated by NMI and traceable to national standards. Then I use this to calibrate the working instruments, and that has proven the calibration, but that's only part of the story. I also need to prove the validation of the equipment by testing it on an MEP pad. And an MEP pad is a rubber pad, which I'll show you when I get back on video. But I also have to prove the proficiency testing of the equipment by doing a round robin, an international round robin with the equipment every 2 years with other companies that do the same thing overseas. Now, this has been helped to me by FIFA, because FIFA does a round robin testing every year and proficiency testing, and part of that is they're connected with World Rugby, and so I have to do a critical fall height test round robin with the other 20 test institutes around the world and now we can compare results on that. But of course, COVID's come along and now it's stopped all that. So what they've been doing is sending us samples, and so I've had lots of samples come in. I've actually got samples in the lab at the moment where I've got a test for critical fall height, AAA, AA, ball rebound, rotation resistance, and other tests that are used in the sport area. So that allows me to get around the fact that I have to do these round robins every couple of years. Questions? Wow. So I'll just come back to the screen. Hang on, I've got that. Whoops. Go back. Right, I'll just try and unshare my screen. I'll do that.
Yeah, all good, Grant. We have had a couple of questions come through the chat.
Can you see me now? Am I back?
I can.
Yeah, great. I actually got emailed a couple of questions as well. Except I just closed it off.
That's all right. I've had a couple of people ask questions in the chat while you've been presenting. I might actually bring them in. Sandy, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question direct to Grant?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
How are you, Grant?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good, mate. Good. Hey, listen, just with the 1000 HIC, the recommendation is 2 drops over and 2 drops under. What happens on the rare occurrence that you can't get over? So we've done some sand here and it's tested over 5 metres. So what's the recommendation if we just can't get over that 1000 HIC? Is 4 drops under acceptable?
Yes, if you can't get over it, you plot it. What the problem is that if you're going to be testing at 3 metres and you still can't get to above the critical fall height, it's like me testing the bark. When I've got a 5.5 metre critical fall height, luckily I have a machine that can actually go to 6 metres because I do a lot of bouldering testing. It allows me to get to that high, but the normal machines can't go over about 3.5 metres.
Yep. So
the worry, and the reason they did that of the maximum 3 metres was to stop the extrapolation. So in other words, you don't want to do a drop at half a metre, 1 metre, 1.5 metres, 2 metres, and say you have a critical fall height of 4 metres. You didn't even test anywhere near 4 metres or 3 metres to work it out. So by doing the 2 drops above and below, but you're right, you just have to report it as what it is because you couldn't get to that height. So you really only report it as that maximum of 3 metres.
Yep, that's good. Thanks, mate.
Monique, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your follow-up question to Grant?
Yeah, that's fine. Hi, Grant. You mentioned a few times about having to retest sites because of how they degrade over time, and thinking about this from a maintenance perspective of play spaces and licensed play spaces from council. Just wondering, is there recommendations around that for different types of surfaces, or do you make recommendations? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
On the maintenance of the surface?
Yeah, just if there is a general recommendation as to how often a certain surface should be tested to ensure that it's performing as it's required.
Yeah, this is the other issue, is that the standard only says 3 years, which is quite a long time between tests on the surfaces. We're doing a comprehensive inspection yearly on it, but we're only testing the surface every 3 years, assuming that everything's okay and there hasn't been a flood and there's no mud in the system and it hasn't, deteriorated in the sun. You're right. There is guidelines. A lot of the time you've got to go back to the manufacturer, but a lot of the time they don't know either. And so I'm connected to a body called SAPIA, which is a Sport and Play Industry Association, and they've got together as a group of sports builders and wet pool rubber and playground installers, and they have a code of practice on and covers that topic. And we're writing a new one at the moment on artificial grass. We've already done one on wet pool rubber, and in that document it has some good examples of what to do on maintaining wet pool rubber. But you should be able to go to the manufacturer and also give you what recommendations. One of the things is basically cleaning it is the other. But I also get involved in a lot of the issues with degradation of the surfaces when the rubber breaks down. The UV, it gets attacked by UV, it goes white. One of the latest things that happened last year, or a couple of years ago now, was that we get dumped into Australia by these overseas products all the time. And they go, oh, look, we can't sell it to Europe because their standards are too good. We can't sell it to America because they've got requirements as well. Oh, we'll dump it in Australia. They don't have any standards. It's not mandatory. Standards in Australia aren't mandatory. So, oh, yeah, we'll just put it in there. No one will notice. Well, 2 years ago, we had all this EPDM rubber that was going all soft and gooey and sticky. And it was sticking on people's clothes, or you'd walk onto it and your foot would go into the surface. And so about 20 playgrounds had to be ripped out. And then we've had the other thing, whereas last year, all the rubber surfaces were cracking badly. We had an issue with the urethane, and this was cracking every metre, like ripping itself apart. And the wet pour industry, the installers, were pulling their hair out because they were doing thousands of dollars, and it was nothing to do with them. Of course, the supplier of the urethane and the wet pour rubber manufacturers, they say, oh, no, you did it too early in the morning. It was too cold. It was too wet. The humidity wasn't right. Well, these guys have been installing it for 20 and 30 years, and so they really know what they're doing. So, okay, yeah, maybe one mistake, but not 20 different installers at the same time. All of a sudden, their rubber starts to crack up for no reason. And then we found out that there was a urethane factory burned down overseas, and they couldn't get supply of one of the major components that went into that urethane. And so they were substituting, and that's what caused the issue.
Interesting. I guess that then it goes as well, extends to, I know that replacing rubber softball, it's really difficult to dispose of as well and costly. So when a surface erodes, the time frame associated with that to then remove it but then reinstall it, it's quite costly for councils.
And the other thing that I'll quickly mention is also microplastics is the big issue that's coming. And microplastics is, no one wants to see microplastics getting washed down the drain, and we've got a standard now that covers that in Australia, which was very proactive with the whole committee to get that up, to stop any of the microplastics. And a lot of it has to do with the loose rubber, the loose black rubber in the artificial grass surfaces for FIFA and World Rugby, and that if that's not contained properly, it'll wash down the drain and pollute the waterways. And so this standard then allows them to stop that, getting it washed down the drain, filter it, have concrete edges, fences, and washing your feet so that we don't lose that microplastic. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. What's going to happen next is artificial grass is going to be the next target to be banned as a product because it fibrulates and breaks up, and all little particles of the plastic wash down the drain. So therefore, that's going to be the next target on what's going to happen with that. So we need in place situations where we can replace it after 10 years so that doesn't happen, because I've walked into some playgrounds and all I've seen is black, the backing is left, all the grass is gone, and all you see is these ribs of little tufts of grass everywhere because there's nothing left. Most people don't let it get to that though.
What was the name of that organisation that you referenced again?
SAPIA, SAPIA. It's the Sports and Play Industry Association. I'm on the board for that, and they have so it's a different bent on the similar thing for what you guys are doing. It's not so much targeted on the playgrounds, but they do have the wet pour rubber guy industry and joined that. So they needed an association to join, and so we got with the builders, the Court Builders Association, and formed a SAPIA. And so we've got a couple of code of practices, and it's copying or mirroring SAPCA, which is a European English company association that does a similar sort of thing overseas, and they've got some code of practices too. And the beauty of a code of practice is that you can then change it quite quickly and dynamically, whereas a standard tends to be what you can't do and how you can't do it. It doesn't tell you how to do it, whereas a code of practice you can write and make it so that you can educate newbies coming into the thing, because we get a lot of newbies in the industry. We get a lot of concrete guys going, oh look, I can do wet pour rubber, and the next minute they ring me up and say, yeah, can you come and test my surface? I said, well, have you had it tested before? No, you're going to tell me that now. So I said to them, you've got no idea what sort of fall height you're going to get out of this. And they go, yeah, that's the idea. You're going to tell me now as I do the test on site, rather than what are they sold? What are they told this client of what critical fall height they're going to get, because they've never had it done before. This is how a lot of people start in the industry. They've got no idea.
Grant, we've got a number of questions Bob makes the comment in relation to purchasing bark or mulch. So in a nutshell, you can't go to your local garden supplier and claim it's softfall. You'd agree with that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And a lot of them try it.
Yeah. Craig Shop, do you want to take yourself off mute and pose your question for Grant?
I can do that. G'day, Grant. Nice presentation, mate.
Thanks. Bit technical.
Yeah, it's good that you're talking about the people who are doing the soft fall rubber and issues around lab testing. That my question there is an update to 4422 going to actually specify or mandate a requirement where they should be getting their rubber material retested on a 3 to 5 year basis? I've seen reports from laboratories dated 2009, and people are passing that off as this tells you that my material is good, which anyone who's got 5 minutes of quality control knows that that's crap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a big issue in the industry. I've actually had the police involved in a couple of fraud cases where they've taken my certificate, put their own name on top of it, and palmed it off as someone else's, and then the secretary in that company rings me up and says, "Can I get it retested?" And I said, "Well, you've never had it tested in the first place." So
terrific.
Yeah.
So no, I see that as a massive issue. I think historically, I'm in South Australia. Historically, there's been fairly limited testing of certainly soft fall rubber in SA because there hasn't really been a lot of people here to do it. They'll bring someone in from interstate if they do it at all. And yeah, I'm finding a lot of issues out there. And the first thing that happens is they'll sit there, they'll give you a report, which is well and truly out of date, saying that historically something was tested.
Yeah.
So the other big one, which you've obviously made really good points on, is the fact that a lot of these people don't seem to know the difference between your critical height and your fall height. They just lay everything at the fall height in South Australia, and then they argue that my testing's wrong.
Yeah, this is the big worry I have with the sand, because the bark, you test it, you get 3 meters, it's wonderful, use it anywhere. But sand, people will give me sand and say, test it anyway. And I said, well, your fall height's going to be 600 millimeters. What are you going to use that for? But because they've got a certificate to say it's 600 millimeters and people don't read the fine print, they'll palm it off on someone. So I won't certify anything under 1.5 meters for sand for critical fall height, because then at least they can sell it into childcare centres. The other thing is too, South Australia, I get a lot of Mount Gambier sand sent to me, and they test it. So they seem to have good sand, but their yields and the quality of the sand is quite hard to get, because you might be mining the sand and your yield might only be 30%. That's good enough to actually give you a critical fall height sand that you can use. And I have this in other industries as well. I have the same issue with FIFA. Their sands are very strictly controlled on their particular range they should get. And I won't do a FIFA job unless they send me the sand before they built the thing, because I don't want to get to the stage where at the end of the day I say, oh, guess what? Your sand fails. It's going to cost you, $300,000 to fix it. So they should be sending me the sand before they even start production, because I can say, yes, that sand's okay. But because they have to manufacture this sand, it's yielded, it has to be sieved and put through different gradings to get the actual product. It's the same with the playground sand. The only good sand you can just dig out of the ground and use is the stuff that comes out of Cairns and Townsville. That's fantastic.
All right. Great. Thanks, mate.
Hey, yep. Bob, I feel like we didn't address your comment properly. You had a follow-up question. Do you want to just take yourself off mute and ask Grant, please?
Just a quick, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yep, good. That's all right. Just one thing with 2017, Grant, with comprehensive inspections or audits, it requires impact testing to be a part of that inspection. I'm noticing that a lot of level 3 comprehensive audits are being conducted with no impact testing.
That's true. A lot of the inspectors don't have the gear yet to actually do it, and they're then getting other people in to do it. And you can do that. It actually says in the standard you can have 2 different people to do the different impact test or the thing. It's more the customer needs to be aware that they need to get it done as well. It is a difficult one though, Bob. I agree.
All right. Last one, Fiona. You're up next.
Just getting myself off mute.
All good.
Grant, hi there. Just wondering if there's any recent updates on agreed methods of heat testing of unitary surfaces.
Oh,
What a grin.
yeah. The heat testing that I did for you before was done through FIFA's box method of doing the testing. It is a hot topic at the moment in playgrounds because we've got people looking at the build-up of heat in the cities, and that's quite an issue. I've just saw some research last week that Dara from Ballarat University did, and she's on the same board for the AFL for the standard committee for the AFL, writing the standard for the AFL for artificial grass, and heat was a big issue with them, and so she's continuing to do heat research on that. A lot of it's done outdoors, and she's trying to work out a way to correlate the heat exposure, humidity, and temperature, and it's also to do with the player perception of the player on it. And so a lot of her work is done on this perception of heat of the player and what they're perceiving the heat to be. And this is the issue with the temperature of heat. It's not so much that you can say that it's hot and it's sticky, but how do you actually do sport in that environment? Now I have this test method. I've just quickly explained to everybody what I did for you with your concrete slide and the plastic slide and the silver slide. I've got a heat chamber where you put it in a heat chamber, you heat it up with lights over 24 hours, and you plot the heat transfer through the steel and through the plastic slide. And it was very interesting because we've had a lot of issues of kids having burns on plastic slides. We had one in South Australia, which I was involved with, where the 2-year-old was picked up and put on a slide, and because kids don't react and don't pull their feet away, she was standing there just screaming. They didn't know why, but she had 3rd-degree burns to her feet on a plastic slide. Now, when you do the lab testing of this stuff, you find that you got steel slides coming out about 70 degrees. You've got plastic slides coming out about 60 degrees. The concrete slide came out at about 60 degrees, and it was pretty cool. But then if you think about what happens with the heat and heat retention, and the idea of this test is actually look at heat retention into the system, because FIFA were trying to categorise surfaces on their heat retention. And so you could say one was a class 1 and one was a class 5. One was bad, one was good. A bit like you do with the STAR system on energy rated equipment. And so they've rated different surfaces. So when you get a wet surface like a cork material, that's a lot cooler than something with a black rubber in it. But the black rubber with the shock pad underneath sucked all the heat into it, and it got hotter and hotter and hotter as the days went on. And that's what happened with the concrete slide. It will get hot at the end. But a lot of the time it's the perception of the user. The user will go, oh, it's a stainless slide, it's the middle of summer, I won't get on it. So you don't get the burns on steel slides because they know it's hot. But you do on the plastic slides because they don't think it's hot. So this is what Dara is trying to work out with the heat perception studies on your sport as well. That was a bit of an answer.
Fascinating.
Thanks, Fiona. Now we've had Rob and Mary with their hands up for a while. Barb, I think we both go to Rob and Mary, and then we'll round out with final points from Grant. Rob, did you want to go first?
Yep. Just.
Oh, you're on mute, Rob. There we go.
There, gotcha. Hi, Grant. Rob Wilson.
Hello, Rob.
G'day. You said before that synthetic grass is deemed to be a loose fill surface. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, because you've got a loose fill of sand in the synthetic grass, depending what you got in it. They could have sand and they could have rubber.
Yeah.
And so therefore you should be doing the test method of where you do 3 drops at one height, 3 drops at the next height, 3 drops at the next height, 3 drops at the next height, which means you've got to do 12 drops to work out your critical fall height of the surface. This is why the 1 drop method in a field is so good, because you can walk in and do the 1 drop and you know it's going to pass. Whereas actually trying to work out the critical fall height of grass takes a bit of work.
Ooh, okay. I've been categorising it. It's difficult to know what's underneath it if you've got rubber underneath it, it's not a loose fill. Is that right?
No. Yeah, sand's in it, it's loose fill. So there is one of the sporting bodies, one of the standards has actually tried to rectify that by saying that artificial grass isn't a loose fill, but it's an overseas standard. So we haven't got it yet in Australia.
According to 4422, it's loose fill.
Yeah, but in 4422, it's very loose fill.
Oops. Thank you. Oh, the other thing I did want a secondary, if I may. What I've found in testing is if there's a roof over pine bark, it's much harder to get it to pass because it's dry. What's your experience with that?
Yes, same issue. The water, it's interesting because the bark mulch decomposes, and so the bark, as it decomposes out in the area, the bottom layer gets this compost layer as it decomposes. And one of the biggest things you shouldn't do with bark is dig it up. You shouldn't dig it all up and get rid of it. All you do is top it up. So if you just keep topping it up, you keep this lovely soft decomposed layer underneath, which keeps your critical fall height a lot better than even what I get in the lab. Now, in the lab, when I test it, I have to compact it. Now, when you dump it into a playground, it's very, very full and fluffy. And then a month later, when everybody's played on it, it gets rained on and it gets compacted. So I have to simulate that in the lab to roll it. So I've got this 50 kilo roller, a 20 kilo roller that I roll it and compact it to try and simulate a month of play out in the field. But that's not simulating this bark mulch underlay that you get, the decomposed layer. That gives you a great height. But you're right, you can, if you only got 200 mil thick of in there, and this is the beauty of the bark mulch thing, is that you install it at 300, but when it gets down to 200, that's when you've got to top it back up again. And that change simplified everything, whereas before it was a nightmare to understand how to work out how much you needed.
Yep.
Thanks,
Okay,
Rob.
thank you.
One last person, Mary. We'll go to you before we round out things with Grant.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Hi, Grant. How are you?
Oh, hello.
Yeah. Just two questions. When I've done testing and the critical fall height is 10%, under 10% of the fall height, so it's close to failing. I always recommend a retest after 1 year, just in case one of the spots tested, may have had something there.
Yep.
Would you agree with that?
I would.
Right.
I would. If you're getting a surface that, say, you've got a fall height of 1.5 metres and you're testing your surface and you're getting 1.5 metres, and it's several years old, or maybe even not several years old, but you're right. In that year's time, in the 3 years' time before it's retested, it could drop down below the critical fall height to 1.4. But the other thing you got to, I actually do that myself. I have in the report that I'll say that if it's less than 10%, well, it's the same critical fall height as the free height of fall, I will then say, look, it's recommended to get it tested in the next year in case it goes down below. And you also tell the client that, well, you might be getting ready to replace it. It's getting old. You're going to need to look at starting to do it. So I mean, you're giving this feedback to them to know what's going on. But the other issue with that is totally lost my train of thought. The other issue with the critical fall height and retesting period, you have to take into account the age and how it's going to deteriorate in that time frame. And by doing that, you're actually then letting the customer know that, look, you might have a problem with the surface and you need to get it replaced soon.
Okay, and I've got a second question. In a lot of the country areas, they use mainly bark mulch as softfall material, but I find a lot of soil and sand contamination. So I think they're sort of digging around, and now the results have been quite good, but it just bothers me that it's not a uniform material that they've got there.
Yeah, And this comes back to the testing of the bark mulch. You know, it says that if you've got a certified product, you don't need to test it. You do need to check the depth, though. That's all you need to do. Is just check the depth is greater than 200 on that.
Even if there's soil and sand in
in that case, yeah. The problem is, though, that soil and sand, it'll probably still pass if you tested it dry.
Yeah.
If you wet it could still pass as well, because you're tending to wet a surface that just with a bucket of water on it, it doesn't penetrate properly. It doesn't get down to the bottom. You really need a good rain event to actually simulate what I'm doing in the lab. I'm flooding the sample with water and then testing it totally flooded. Whereas you try and chuck a bucket of water on the sand outside, you can get a fire hose and do it. And even then, you're not still testing it as it's done in the lab, because you've only got to test it at 200 mils deep, and it's on a hard surface underneath. Out in the field, it probably won't. It'll probably show that it'll pass even like that. It won't actually show. But what happens when the weather changes and it is flooded and it is wet? Will it go hard and compacted? We don't know. So you can only do what you can do, and that, okay, you can test the surface, and if it passes, great. If it doesn't, great. Then you told the client they've got an issue. The other thing I wanted to point out too is that a lot of people take it as black and white. It's not black and white. It is in some situations. So we've got a critical fall height at 1.5 metres, and we've tested the surface and it fails. Oh my God, it's failing at 1.4. The sky's going to fall in. What's going on? It's changed from 1.5 to 1.4. So on the risk curve, the actual injury probability hasn't changed much at all. It might have changed about 5 or 10%. But if it was a artificial grass with no shock pad, and it was a 2 metre fall height, or they'll get back to 1.5 metre fall height, and they're going to land on the concrete. Well, yeah, that's a critical situation where some kid's going to hit their head and have to go to hospital. So that's a critical situation. But when you're getting only a slight change of being, oh, it's passing or not passing. Now, I had one the other day where I've never had this before. I went out on site and it was 2.5 metres, and the guy had failed it, and he'd been there at 8 o'clock in the morning. I came along and I tested it at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it passed. He got 2.5 metres, and they needed 2.6, and I got like 2.7. We were 200 mils difference. So the temperature of the day, we both couldn't believe this, and when we did it again, but then we did it later in the day, and it passed with flying colours. And then since then we said, okay, now we've got to go back and check it, because something's happening here. We better check it in 6 months' time, see what happens. And now it's actually got better over time. This was the difference between just being installed, probably not cured properly, and then later on down the track it actually got better. But again, be careful of temperature on the surfaces, because it does change the critical fall height.
Grant,
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
I'm mindful of time. Thanks for being so generous with all your information and insights shared. Is there one particular message that you'd like to reinforce and leave everyone with amongst your wide array of content?
Basically about making sure that your critical fall height is greater than your free height of fall, which is the topic of what I was talking about today. There are lots of topics in there that you can touch on and elaborate. So if anybody wants to email me any questions, whatever, they're free to do so, and I'll try and answer them.
Wonderful, Grant. Barb, I might handball it back to you.
Thanks, Kieran. And Grant, you have absolutely reignited my passion for this subject. I think it's so amazing. And I think your last question and answer was in fact one of the most compelling pieces of information. As Mary Jevons taught me years ago, everything depends on the circumstances, and that's the judgment that people in services and councils make every day. And we fully support this view, but we also support the view that they need to be as well informed as they can, so that the decisions that they make are the best decisions. Grant, thank you so much. It was absolutely fantastic. There will be more information available to you as members. David Eager, who has chaired our Standards Committee for many years, has also sent me some information which he says will be complementing yours. And the last point I want to make is that you'll be hearing shortly about the Play Australia Risk Assessors Network. And this is going to be a national network that can continue conversations about this issue. It will be for people who work in the field as independent businesses, and the purpose of it will be is to try to provide best practice advice on some of these very curly issues that standards will never be able to provide information on. So keep an eye out for that. In our next member news, we will have a considerable amount of information on this subject. So thank you, everybody. Next week is we're changing gear a little bit, and we're going to be having our first international guest, who will be Scott McKenzie, who is from New Zealand. And you will be fascinated to see what the New Zealand government is doing across the country in the promotion of play. So you'll get the invitation to that again in the next few days, and we look forward to seeing you all then. So Grant, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your participation. I have enjoyed seeing people, which has just been fantastic, from around the country. Rob in Canberra, Bob in Darwin, Craig in South Australia, Andrew in Western Australia, Mary, who is a new member of our organisation. I think you're in New South Wales, Mary, aren't you? So it's fantastic to see you all, and we hope we'll see you next week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Bye.